No, Sophie, you are unfair. How on earth does one describe oneself? No, I leave that to my people to describe me. I've never been that vain. In fact, you know that over the years I've told you over and over again that it has never been about me, the person. I've never regarded myself as an individual. I'm just part of this whole liberation machine. I've never been an individual. So I can't describe myself outside of the collective. I belong to the collective. The African National Congress prides itself in the collectivity of the leadership of the ANC. And I have never been in a position to say I. I always talk about us as we, because I'm just part of the whole
collective.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe
well, I would be extremely naive if I suggested to you that South Africa of today is exactly what we dreamed of when we gave up our lives for the liberation of our people. It is no secret about the fact that we have problems. They are visible. We have extreme challenges which we didn't have at the beginning. You cannot compare the first dispensation with what is happening today. Originally, yes, it looked like we were going to achieve our beautiful dream. Yes, we were a miracle from the violence of the past. That particular part of the transition to a new democratic South Africa was wonderful. We achieved that. But in the process of doing so, there was naivety on our part. We were not experienced. We didn't know that political freedom was very easy. But political freedom without economic freedom is what has resulted in the challenges we face today. We did not accommodate that particular problem sufficiently because of our vicious past. We come from a very brutal period of our history, a history of a country that was segregated constitutionally. And it was in black and white. Society was divided into 4 categories, and of course I wouldn't bore you with what you know. And to transit from that era to where we are today has been a very painful journey. We made tremendous strides. We made great achievements, but at the same time the difficulties we were confronted with, particularly in relation to the youth. As I've said before to Sophie, that unemployed youth in any country is a ticking time bomb. And I think the fact that we have the parliament we have today is a consequence of the problems I am talking about. It was easy to hoist the flag of freedom and say we were free at last. But then the economy still remained in the hands of the few. And the most difficult part has actually been transformation. We didn't realize how difficult it would be to get back our land because it was owned by the people who had oppressed us all those years, and we had had such a violent history that we wanted to put an end to the armed struggle, difficult as it was, and we were not going to do land grab. We were going to see to it that we passed legislation that saw to it that we got our land back transitionally and amicably. But as you would know, the willing seller, willing buyer policy has not worked as much as many other policies have worked. We have passed a lot of legislation trying to transform South Africa amicably. But of course, the masses down there do not necessarily bother to think of the fact that it cannot be done overnight. And for a people who had been oppressed for so many years, you can't blame them for having been impatient with the leadership. And you can't blame them when they wonder whether this is the South Africa they fought for. And unfortunately, because of our history of our country, the pace is not as much as we would have wanted it to be, the pace of transformation.
Mama,
in 1969, Winnie Mandela was again arrested, this time under the Terrorism Act. 21 others were arrested at the same time, but Winnie was held in solitary confinement for 16 months.
When they detained me, I had just been to a heart specialist. I have a heart condition, and the security branch knew that. They knew I had been to the doctor. They knew I had been to a heart specialist, and I think they particularly arrested me then because of that knowledge, with the hope that perhaps the condition would worsen in prison, and that whatever happened to me would then be attributed to natural causes. The cell in which I was held at the beginning was so small that if I stretched my hands, I touched both walls. I could barely exercise. In this cell, all I had was a plastic bottle with about 5 glasses of water, a homemade sanitary bucket, and 3 blankets and a sisal mat. That is all, besides what I was wearing. Being held in Communicado is one of the cruelest things any human being can do to another. About a week after I was held, I was transferred to the condemned cell. A condemned cell means a cell that usually holds prisoners who are going to be executed. In this condemned cell, there were 2 grill doors besides the prison door. To this day, the memory of that bunch of keys, the clicking, the noise they would deliberately make in the stillness and solitude of a prison life. You actually felt they were hitting the inner core of your soul. They never switched off the light. I had this floodlight night and day. I lost track of time. This particular wardress who always brought my food would open the cell door, and I could hear someone outside putting the food down. And she would stand right at the entrance to the cell. They would then take the bucket, the sanitary bucket, and turn the lid upside down and put your plate of food on that. And she would stand right at the cell door and kick the food in, kick it into the cell. The mind finds it very difficult to adjust to such solitude. It is such utter torture that I could feel that my mind was so tortured with lack of doing something and not communicating with anyone that I would find myself talking to the children. I would think I am thinking about them, and actually find myself in the end conducting conversations with my children as if they are with me in the cell. It becomes so difficult to keep sane with absolutely nothing to do that I would actually hunt for ants. If I had an ant in the cell or a fly, then I would regard myself as having company for the day. When I was given anything, if anything at all, it was the Bible. One day the Swanee Pool stood at the cell door and flung the Bible at my face. And he threw it and said, "There you are, pray. Pray so that your God can get you out of this cell."
While in solitary, Winnie Mandela underwent intensive interrogation under the direction of Police Colonel Swanepoel.
He was the one who murdered a lot of my people behind bars. He was actually the horror of Pretoria Central. I was interrogated right through, day and night, for 7 days and 7 nights. As they changed the teams, Swanepoel would rub his hands and say he is waiting for that moment when they shall break me completely. By the time they interrogated me, they knew everything. They knew all about my political activities at the time. And the African National Congress, of course, was a banned organization, which meant that whatever political activities I was involved in at that time were underground political activities. There was nothing they didn't know. They had managed to break a few of those they had interrogated before me. The body devises its own defensive mechanisms. I didn't know it was such relief to faint, for instance. And during the only moment I ever had any rest from the intensive interrogation and intensive questioning, where your mind just loses track of everything, was during those fainting spells. They were so relieving. I could recover, and from each fainting spell, when I came round, I felt a little refreshed to face more and more interrogation. On the 7th day, I started urinating blood, and the body was swollen like a balloon. I don't know the medical explanation for that, whether it's because of sitting in one position for days and nights right through. But my legs, for instance, were as if they were just poles that were not part of my body. I could actually feel the weight, so swollen, so oedemous they were, that I found it difficult to stand. And that didn't stop my interrogators in any way. I don't remember how I was brought back to the cell. I found myself just there on Sunday. In the end, the fainting spells were much more acute, I think, as the body was beginning to give in to that type of brutality. Prior to my detention, I knew that as a mother and as a social worker, life, the human being, was so sacrosanct that I could never on my own lift up a finger against any human being for ideological reasons. But what I went through, that personal experience, hardened me so much that at the end of my interrogation, looking at my interrogators and what I had gone through, I knew that as I sat in that cell, if my own father or my brother walked in dangling a gun, and he was on the other side, and I had a gun too in my hand, in defense of the ideals for which I was being tortured, then I would fire. The security branch had made me the soldier at heart I am today. There was no way that you could talk any language of peace to vicious men who treated defenseless women and children in that manner. I realized then that the Afrikaner had closed the chapter of negotiation, and that the decision taken by my leaders in 1962 was arrived at with difficulty, but that there was no other way. The decision to defend our honor, the decision to stop turning the biblical other cheek, the white man, had hit us for too long. Our patience had been tested and had endured for too long. I knew then that somehow there had to be a political crisis in this country for us to reach the ultimate goal. That is what I emerged as in 1969, 1970, during my months of solitary confinement.
The charges against Winnie and her co-defendants were dismissed. She was jailed again and arrested, and again arrested. Mandela wrote to her,
"When I married him, he was already a prisoner, in fact. We met during his treason trial, and he had to get permission, in fact, to get married, because he was not only a prisoner, he was banned. And the trial was on in Pretoria at the time. So he was given 4 days in which to go to the Transkei and get married, which is where we got married, on the 14th of June 1958. Well, I have lived most of my life alone. The best years of my life really have been those spent under banning orders, and the past, of course, 7 years have been spent here in exile. Exile here means virtually really being in prison at your own expense. And it is the extreme isolation that is very, very difficult. And being away from friends and completely isolated intellectually, being in a place like this where you can hardly interact intellectually with the community, that one finds extremely difficult. And of course, worst of all was being without my children and not having the opportunity to play the role of a parent like all parents in democratic societies. Virtually both of us have really not had that opportunity to be parents to our children.
And the future? Do you believe you will see liberation in your lifetime?
Oh, certainly. That I'm completely convinced of. That is why even exile is so worthwhile, because I'm absolutely certain that we shall attain our liberation. And even being in exile really is a constant reminder of the sickness of our society, and that we are virtually in prison, even in our country. Those who are outside
outside prison walls are simply in a bigger prison, because the black man is virtually a prisoner, and all those other fellow whites and other groups that are as oppressed as we are all really in prison, in a bigger apartheid prison.